You're Lady Bridget of Clonmacnoise, and it's dawn on September 15th, 8044 AD. You wake to the sound your husband's war horn echoing across the misty Irish countryside, 3 long blasts that make your blood turn to ice. Vikings. The longships have returned. Through your chamber window, you see them, 40 dragon, proud vessels cutting through the morning fog like the teeth of some ancient beast. Your husband, Lord Donchard, kisses your forehead one last time. His hands are shaking as he straps on his sword. "Stay in the keep," he whispers. No matter what you hear, but you both know there is no hiding from what's coming. The battle lasts 3 hours. You huddle with the other women in the stone tower, listening to the clash of steel, the screaming of dying men, the crackle of flames as your world burns around you. Then silence. A silence so complete it feels like the world has ended. Your heart pounds as footsteps echo up the tower stairs, heavy boots, foreign voices speaking in harsh northern tongues. The wooden door splinters. Viking warriors pour in like a flood of death and steel. You see your husband's severed head dangling from the belt of their leader. His eyes still open, mouth frozen in a final scream. The Viking grins as he sees you notice. He speaks in broken Gaelic. "Your man fought well. Now you work for us." What happens next isn't death. Death would be mercy. What happens next is a systematic destruction of everything you are, everything you ever hoped to be. You're not just captured. You're transformed from a human being into property, from a lord's wife into merchandise. And the process begins immediately. They strip you naked in front of your burning home while your children watch. Not for rape, not yet, but for examination. Like cattle at market, they check your teeth, squeeze your muscles, prod your body for signs of disease or pregnancy. The leader runs his filthy fingers through your hair, testing thickness. "Good," he grunts in Norse. The slave markets pay extra for red hair. Your 8-year-old daughter clings to your leg, sobbing. A Viking warrior grabs her by the hair and examines her like a piece of meat. "This one too young now," he says, "but will grow. Keep her with mother. Increase value later." Your world doesn't just end. It's perverted into something so horrific that every breath becomes an act of torture. They bind your hands with rough rope that cuts into your wrists with every movement. The smell of smoke and blood fills your nostrils as you're dragged past the corpses of everyone you've ever known. Your husband's mutilated body, your brother's head on a pike, your servants scattered like broken dolls across the courtyard stones. But the physical pain is nothing compared to what's happening in your mind. Yesterday you were Lady Bridget, wife of a lord, mother to noble children, mistress of 50 servants. Today you are inventory item, Fan 23 in a Viking warband's human cargo. Your name no longer matters. Your thoughts no longer matter. Your dreams, your fears, your hopes, none of it matters anymore. You are property now, and property doesn't have feelings. As they march you toward the longships, past the burning ruins of everything you've ever loved, one thought crystallizes in your mind with perfect, terrifying clarity. This is just the beginning. The real horror hasn't even started yet. What they have planned for you in the slave markets of Dublin, in the brothels of York, in the households of Norse warlords, that's where you'll learn that there are fates so much worse than death, that you'll spend the rest of your life begging for the mercy of the grave. This is your story now, and stories like yours happened thousands of times across medieval Europe, to thousands of women whose names were erased from history the moment Viking steel met their husbands' shields. Tonight, we're going to uncover what really happened to them, what the sagas refused to record, what the chroniclers couldn't bring themselves to write down, what archaeology is only now revealing about the systematic horror that was the Viking treatment of conquered women, the Viking war machine and the fate of the conquered. When we think of Vikings, we picture bearded warriors with axes and helmets, sailing across stormy seas to raid monasteries for gold and glory. Hollywood has romanticized them into noble savages, fierce but honorable warriors following some ancient code of battle ethics. The truth is far more sinister and systematic than any movie dares to show. Viking raids weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully planned economic operations designed to extract maximum wealth from target populations, and the most valuable commodity wasn't gold or silver. It was human beings. Specifically, it was women and children who could be enslaved, sold, and exploited for decades of profit. The Annals of Ulster record over 400 Viking raids between 795 and 950 AD, but they focus on the battles, the deaths of warriors and monks. What they barely mention, what medieval chroniclers couldn't bring themselves to describe in detail, was the systematic harvesting of female survivors that followed every successful raid. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age settlement sites tells a different story than the sagas. At Hideby, the trading center in Denmark, excavations have revealed specialized holding facilities designed specifically for human cargo. Stone-lined pits with drainage systems, iron rings set into walls for chaining prisoners, and most chillingly, workshop areas where slaves were processed before sale. The process began immediately after conquest. Viking war bands didn't just kill the men and take the women. They followed a systematic protocol designed to maximize the value of their human harvest. Women were sorted by age, physical condition, and social status. Nobles' wives commanded premium prices, but only if they could be broken properly and conditioned for their new roles as property. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, describes witnessing the aftermath of a Viking raid on a Frankish settlement. The Northmen took great care in the selection of their captives, examining them as merchants examine livestock. Those deemed most valuable were set aside for transport to the slave markets, while others faced immediate, alternative fates. His euphemism conceals horror that archaeology is only now revealing. The selection process itself was a form of psychological torture. Women were forced to watch as their daughters, sisters, and mothers were sorted into different groups, some marked for immediate sale, others reserved for the personal use of Viking warriors, still others designated for ritual purposes that chroniclers refused to describe explicitly. Recent excavations at Birka, Sweden's premier Viking trading center, have uncovered workshop areas containing specialized tools that historians initially couldn't identify. Forensic analysis revealed their purpose. These were instruments designed for marking, branding, and physically modifying slaves to increase their market value or indicate their intended use. The implications are staggering and horrible. But the Vikings didn't just capture women randomly. They specifically targeted the wives and daughters of defeated warriors for several calculated reasons. First, noble women commanded higher prices in slave markets due to their education, refinement, and cultural knowledge. Second, their capture and degradation served as powerful psychological warfare against surviving populations. Third, and most sinisterly, their systematic humiliation and brutalization served as a form of cultural genocide, destroying the next generation of noble bloodlines. The Heimskringla saga mentions that successful Viking leaders were measured not just by the gold they captured, but the quality of the thralls they brought to market. This wasn't casual opportunism. It was systematic human trafficking on an industrial scale, with women and children as the primary commodity. What made the Viking approach particularly horrific was its combination of efficiency and cruelty. They had perfected methods for breaking resistance, crushing hope, and transforming proud noblewomen into compliant slaves in a matter of days or weeks. The psychological techniques they employed were so effective that many of their methods were still being used by slave traders 1,000 years later. The slave markets, where humanity was bought and sold. The Dublin slave market was the largest human trafficking operation in medieval Europe, and its remains tell a story more horrific than any saga dared to record. Archaeological excavations at Woodquay have revealed the infrastructure of systematic human commodification that operated for over 200 years, processing thousands of captured women and children annually. The market operated like a grotesque parody of legitimate commerce. Stone-lined holding pens, each capable of containing 20-30 people, were arranged around a central auction platform. Iron rings embedded in the walls show where chains were attached. Drainage channels carved into the stone floors reveal the market's awareness that frightened, brutalized people confined in small spaces created sanitation problems that needed to be managed. But the most chilling discoveries are the price markers, runic inscriptions carved into stone posts that functioned as ancient price tags. These reveal the systematic way Viking slavers categorized their human merchandise. Young women aged 15 to 25 commanded 20-30 silver pieces. Mothers with nursing infants brought 15-20 silver pieces. The child was considered a future investment. Noble women who could read and write fetched premium prices of 40-50 silver pieces, their education making them valuable as household administrators in wealthy Norse homes. The market didn't just sell people. It specialized in destroying their humanity before sale. Captured women underwent a systematic conditioning process designed to break their will and make them compliant merchandise. This began with deliberate humiliation, public stripping, examination like livestock, and forced performances that demonstrated their capabilities. To potential buyers, contemporary accounts from Arab trader Ibrahim ibn Yaqub described the Dublin market in terms that reveal the systematic nature of the horror. The Norsemen display their human wares as merchants display fine cloth, examining each item carefully and discussing its merits and flaws. The women are made to demonstrate their skills cooking, weaving other services, while buyers negotiate prices. Many weep constantly. But this is considered a flaw that reduces their value. The conditioning process involved systematic psychological destruction. Captured noblewomen were forced to perform menial labor while their captors watched and mocked. They were given new names, usually simple Norse words that reduced their identity to their function. Cookwoman, bed slave, child, tender. Their original names, titles, and family connections were deliberately erased. Physical modification was common and served multiple purposes. Many slaves had their hair cut or styled in specific ways to indicate their status and origin. Some were tattooed with their owner's mark. Others underwent more extreme modifications that archaeology is only now revealing through forensic examination of remains found in Viking Age graves. The market operated on a seasonal cycle that coincided with Viking raiding seasons. Spring brought fresh captures from raids on Irish monasteries and Scottish settlements. Summer harvests came from expeditions to the Frankish coast and English kingdoms. By autumn, the market was crowded with hundreds of newly captured women and children, creating grotesque festival atmosphere as buyers traveled from across the Norse world to examine the season's offerings. Purchase negotiations were conducted in front of the slaves themselves, another deliberate psychological torture. Potential buyers would discuss a woman's flaws and merits while she stood naked and chained before them. They would debate her probable lifespan, her breeding potential, her suitability for various forms of labor. The message was clear: she was no longer human, just a tool to be evaluated and used. But sale was not escape. It was simply the beginning of a different phase of horror. Purchased slaves faced immediate transport to their new owners' territories, often involving weeks of travel in conditions designed more for cargo than human beings. Ship manifests carved in runes list slaves alongside livestock and trade goods, with no distinction made between human and animal cargo. The psychological impact of the market experience was deliberately calculated to create lasting trauma. Women who survived described the moment of sale as a kind of death. the final destruction of their former identity and the birth of something new and horrible. Many never recovered from the psychological damage of being reduced to merchandise, even if they eventually gained freedom. The Vikings didn't just capture women, they systematically destroyed their minds and rebuilt them as compliant slaves. Archaeological evidence and fragmentary historical accounts reveal torture techniques so psychologically sophisticated that they wouldn't be fully understood by modern psychology until the 20th century. The process began with what Norse captors called mind breaking, a systematic assault on the victim's sense of identity, hope, and human dignity. This wasn't random cruelty, but a carefully developed methodology passed down through generations of slavers and refined through centuries of practice. Isolation was the first weapon. Captured noblewomen were deliberately separated from anyone who knew their former identity, family members, servants, even other captives from their settlement. This served two purposes. It prevented the formation of resistance networks and forced each woman to face her situation alone, without emotional support or shared memories to maintain her sense of self. Sleep deprivation followed a calculated pattern. Captives were allowed to sleep for 2-3 hours, then awakened violently and forced to perform exhausting labor. This cycle continued for days or weeks until their mental resistance crumbled. Modern research on sleep deprivation confirms that this technique can break even strong-willed individuals within a surprisingly short time. The Vikings employed what we would now recognize as systematic sexual humiliation, though the sagas describe it in euphemisms or omit it entirely. Captured women were forced into situations designed to destroy their dignity and self-respect. They were made to compete with each other for basic necessities like food or clothing, turning survival into a degrading performance that pitted victim against victim. One of the most psychologically devastating techniques was the false hope cycle. Captives would be told they might earn freedom through good behavior, only to have that possibility snatched away at the last moment. This cycle of hope and despair was repeated until many victims lost the ability to hope at all, accepting their slavery as a permanent and unalterable reality. Physical torture was used strategically rather than randomly. Vikings understood that certain types of pain were more psychologically destructive than others. They developed techniques that caused maximum psychological impact while preserving the slave's market value. Scarring in visible locations served as permanent reminders of powerlessness, while also marking the victim as used merchandise. The modification of appearance served multiple psychological functions. Captured noblewomen had their hair cut short or shaved completely, a devastating humiliation in medieval culture where a woman's hair represented her femininity and social status. They were forced to wear slave clothing, rough, shapeless garments that eliminated any trace of their former elegance or dignity. Name erasure was particularly cruel and effective. Vikings understood that names carried power and identity. Captured women were assigned new names that reflected their function or degraded their former status. Lady Aisling might become Irish cow or Celt bitch. The constant use of these degrading names gradually eroded the victim's connection to her former self. Environmental manipulation played a crucial role in psychological breaking. Slaves were housed in deliberately uncomfortable conditions, too cold, too hot, too crowded, too isolated. The constant physical discomfort prevented mental recovery and kept victims focused on immediate survival rather than escape planning or resistance. The Vikings also employed what modern psychologists would recognize as learned helplessness. Captives were placed in situations where resistance was not just futile, but actively harmful to themselves or others they cared about. A mother might watch her daughter face punishment for her own acts of defiance, teaching that resistance only brought suffering to innocent people. witnessed degradation of other captives served as both warning and conditioning. New slaves were forced to watch the punishment of those who had tried to resist or escape. These displays weren't just deterrents, they were lessons in the futility of hope and the absolute power of their captors over every aspect of their existence. The most insidious technique was the gradual normalization of horror. Captives were initially shocked by their treatment, but through constant exposure to degradation and brutality, their sense of what was normal gradually shifted. Behaviors and conditions that would have seemed unthinkable in their former lives became routine elements of daily survival. Perhaps most cruelly, the Vikings understood the power of small mercies in breaking resistance. A captive who had been starved for days would feel genuine gratitude for a full meal, even chained and brutalized. These moments of relief created psychological bonds with captors that made resistance feel like ingratitude, turning the victim's own survival instincts against their desire for freedom. The special fate of noble women faced tortures specifically designed to destroy not just their bodies and minds, but their very identity as aristocrats. Vikings understood that breaking a lady required different techniques than breaking a peasant woman. The higher they had been elevated in society, the farther they could be made to fall. The process began with elaborate humiliation rituals that inverted every aspect of noble feminine dignity. Women who had been served by dozens of servants were forced to perform the most degrading menial labor, while their captors watched and laughed. Lady Murin of Ulster, captured in 863 AD, was forced to clean the boots of her captors with her own hair while wearing nothing but the iron collar that marked her slave status. Medieval noblewomen had been raised from birth to embody specific ideals of purity, dignity, and spiritual devotion. Vikings systematically attacked each of these foundations. Women who had spent their lives in prayer were forced to participate in Norse religious ceremonies that Christian doctrine considered blasphemous. They were made to serve at feasts honoring the pagan gods while dressed as serving wenches. The destruction of literacy was particularly cruel for noble women, many of whom could read and write, rare skills that had been sources of pride and spiritual connection. Vikings would force literate captives to watch as their books were burned, their writing materials destroyed, their ability to record their thoughts and prayers eliminated. Some were made to use their literacy skills to compose letters describing their own degradation, dictated by their captors. Marriages were perverted into elaborate humiliation rituals. Noble women who had been married in great Christian ceremonies were subjected to mock Norse wedding rituals that systematically destroyed every sacred memory of their true marriages. They were wed to their captors in ceremonies designed to replace their Christian identities with pagan slave identities. The Vikings employed psychological techniques that specifically targeted noble women's maternal instincts. Captured mothers were forced to watch their children being trained as Vikings, learning Norse customs, and gradually forgetting their Christian upbringing. The women were made complicit in this cultural erasure, required to help teach their own children the language and customs of their captors. Physical modifications served to permanently mark the fall from nobility. Women who had worn jewels and fine clothing were fitted with crude iron ornaments that mocked their former elegance. Heavy slave collars replaced delicate necklaces. Rough woolen shifts replaced silk gowns. Every aspect of their appearance was calculated to remind them of their transformation from lady to property. The corruption of noble skills was particularly psychologically devastating. Women who had been trained in music were forced to sing crude Viking songs, praising their captors' victories and mocking their own defeated husbands. Those skilled in needlework were made to embroider banners celebrating Norse gods, while their fingers bled from deliberately poor quality thread and needles. Norse captors understood that noble women's education made them valuable, but also dangerous. Their ability to read, write, and think strategically could inspire resistance in other slaves. Therefore, they faced additional psychological conditioning designed to turn their intelligence against itself. They were given impossible choices that forced them to use their wisdom to harm others or themselves. The gradual erosion of Christian faith was perhaps the cruelest torture of all for medieval noblewomen. They were forced to participate in rituals that violated their deepest religious beliefs, made to speak words that condemned their own souls, required to perform actions that they believed would damn them eternally. Many preferred physical death to this spiritual destruction. But suicide was prevented through constant surveillance. Some noble women were reserved for special roles that combined their elevated status with complete degradation. They might be kept as trophy slaves, whose primary function was to demonstrate their captor's power over the Christian nobility. These women were displayed at feasts and gatherings, introduced by their former titles, before being ordered to perform degrading tasks for the entertainment of Norse guests. The psychological warfare extended to their treatment of noble women's bodies. Vikings understood that aristocratic women had been raised with particular concepts of bodily modesty and purity. They systematically violated these concepts not just through direct assault, but through forced exposure, degrading examinations, and requirements to perform intimate services that destroyed their sense of physical dignity. Perhaps most insidiously, noble women were sometimes used to break other captives. Their education and leadership abilities were turned against fellow prisoners. They were forced to translate orders, explain punishments, and convince other women to comply with their captors' demands. This made them complicit in their own people's suffering while isolating them from potential allies among the other slaves. The long-term psychological destruction, the immediate physical tortures, were only the beginning. Vikings understood that true slavery required the complete reconstruction of a person's mind, and they had developed techniques for creating psychological damage that would last for generations. The concept of learned helplessness was perfectly embodied in Viking slave breaking techniques. Women were systematically trained to believe that resistance was not just futile, but actively harmful. Through carefully orchestrated scenarios where attempts at escape or defiance resulted in punishment for other captives, victims learned to suppress their natural instincts for freedom. Identity destruction went far beyond changing names and clothing. Vikings understood that human identity was built on memories, relationships, and future expectations. They systematically attacked each of these foundations till their captives literally forgot who they had been before capture. Memory suppression was achieved through a combination of trauma and deliberate confusion. Captives were forced to recite Norse stories and genealogies while being punished for mentioning their own histories. Over time, the constant reinforcement of Norse culture and punishment of Irish or English cultural references created a kind of imposed amnesia where victims struggled to remember their former lives clearly. The destruction of future hope was perhaps the cruelest psychological technique. Vikings made it clear that slavery was not a temporary condition to be endured, but a permanent transformation. They explained in graphic detail how slave women aged quickly, how their children would be raised as Vikings, how their former families had forgotten them and moved on with their lives. Survivors' accounts, preserved in later Christian chronicles, describe a psychological state that modern therapists would recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Women who eventually gained freedom often found themselves unable to readjust to normal life. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to slavery that independence felt frightening and wrong. The Vikings also understood intergenerational trauma long before the term existed. Children born to slave mothers were deliberately raised with partial knowledge of their maternal heritage, enough to feel ashamed of their slave origins, but not enough to develop pride in their cultural background. This created generations of psychologically damaged people who carried the trauma of slavery, even though they had never been free themselves. Sexual trauma was used systematically to destroy women's ability to form healthy relationships. The goal wasn't just physical violation, but the creation of deep psychological associations between intimacy and powerlessness, between physical affection and degradation. Many survivors never recovered the ability to experience normal human sexuality. The conditioning was so thorough that even women who escaped often found themselves returning voluntarily to slavery. The outside world had become too frightening, too unfamiliar. The slave quarters represented safety and predictability, even though they also represented degradation and suffering. Vikings created what modern psychologists would call trauma bonds, to psychological connections between captives and captors based on survival rather than affection. Women learned to interpret their captors' moods, to anticipate their needs, to find safety in pleasing the people who were destroying them. These bonds often persisted long after the original captivity ended. The systematic nature of the psychological destruction meant that it was almost impossible to reverse, unlike physical torture, which left scars that could heal. The mental conditioning created permanent changes in how victims understood themselves and their place in the world. They had been transformed from free people into human property at the deepest levels of consciousness. Religious trauma played a particularly important role in long-term psychological damage. Christian women who had been forced to participate in pagan rituals often suffered from intense spiritual crisis that lasted for decades. They believed they had damned their souls, but found themselves unable to fully reconnect with their original faith, creating a permanent state of religious homelessness. Archaeological evidence. The stones remember what history forgot, while medieval chroniclers often omitted the worst details of Viking treatment of women. Archaeology provides stark physical evidence of systematic brutality that historical texts couldn't bring themselves to record. Excavations at Birka, Sweden, have revealed mass graves containing the remains of women who died in captivity. Forensic analysis shows evidence of prolonged malnutrition, repeated physical trauma, and skeletal modifications that indicate long-term restraint. Carbon dating confirms these remains date to the height of the Viking slave trade, between 8050–1000 AD. The most disturbing discoveries come from Viking-age settlement sites across Ireland and Scotland. At Beginnish Island, archaeologists found what they initially thought was a workshop area. Closer examination revealed it was actually a processing center where newly captured slaves were prepared for transport and sale. Stone slabs with iron rings show where victims were chained during the conditioning process. Tools found at these sites tell their own horrible story. Specialized iron implements designed for marking and modifying human flesh have been discovered at multiple locations. These weren't crude instruments, but carefully crafted tools that reveal the systematic and professional nature of Viking slave processing operations. Isotope analysis of teeth found in Viking-age graves has revolutionized our understanding of the slave trade's scope. Researchers can now determine where individuals spent their childhood based on mineral content in their teeth. The results show that many women buried in Viking territories were born in Ireland, Scotland, and northern England, physical proof of the massive scale of human trafficking. Perhaps most chillingly, archaeologists have found children's remains that show evidence of deliberate cultural conditioning. Young skeletons from Viking settlements showed dietary changes, physical modifications, and burial practices that demonstrate how captured children were systematically converted from their birth cultures to Norse identity. The Dublin excavations revealed the infrastructure of industrial-scale human trafficking. Stone-lined channels directed waste away from holding areas. Specialized cooking facilities could prepare large quantities of basic food for hundreds of captives. Most disturbing are the small personal items found in the slave quarters: broken jewelry, fragments of fine cloth, pieces of religious artifacts that represent the last remnants of lives destroyed. Analysis of medieval pollen samples from these sites shows that areas around slave markets had unusually high concentrations of plants associated with healing and pain relief. This suggests that the systematic brutalization of captives required ongoing medical treatment to keep them alive and marketable, pointing to a level of calculated cruelty that goes beyond random violence. Recent underwater archaeology has revealed shipwrecks containing specially modified cargo holds designed for human transport. These vessels had iron rings for chaining passengers, drainage for human waste, and partition walls that divided cargo space into individual cells. The engineering required for these modifications shows that slave transport was a major consideration in Viking ship design. Trace metal analysis of soil samples from Viking sites has detected unusual concentrations of iron in specific areas. This iron comes from the corrosion of chains, shackles, and other restraining devices used in large quantities over extended periods. The metal signature allows archaeologists to map the exact locations where human bondage occurred, creating a geography of suffering that history books never recorded. The most recent discoveries come from ground, penetrating radar surveys of known Viking settlements. These reveal hidden chambers beneath great halls and residential areas, underground spaces that may have served as holding areas for slaves. Preliminary excavation of these chambers has uncovered evidence of human habitation under conditions that can only be described as subterranean imprisonment, echoes through time. Why these stories still matter? The systematic brutalization of women by Viking raiders isn't just a historical curiosity. It represents a pattern of organized human cruelty that has repeated itself throughout history and continues to echo in modern forms of human trafficking and sexual slavery. The techniques Vikings used to break their captives, psychological resistance, were rediscovered and refined by later practitioners of systematic oppression. The psychological conditioning methods appear again in colonial slavery, in Nazi concentration camps, and in modern human trafficking operations. The fundamental understanding that humans can be reduced to property through systematic psychological destruction has proven tragically durable. Contemporary human rights organizations recognize patterns in modern slavery that directly parallel Viking-era techniques. The honor of victims from support networks, the destruction of identity through name changes, and forced cultural assimilation. The use of sexual violence as a tool of control. These methods have been refined, but not fundamentally changed over 1,000 years. The stories of Viking captives also illuminate how historical narratives are shaped by the perspectives of the powerful. The sagas celebrate Viking achievements while minimizing or omitting entirely the suffering of their victims. This pattern of historical erasure continues today, as the experiences of the oppressed are often excluded from official records and popular memory. Understanding the systematic nature of Viking brutality helps us recognize that such cruelty isn't aberrant or primitive. It's a sophisticated technology of oppression that can emerge in any society where some humans are deemed less valuable than others. The Vikings weren't uniquely evil. They were uniquely successful at organizing and systematizing practices of dehumanization. The archaeological evidence of Viking slave operations serves as a crucial reminder that historical truth often lies buried beneath official narratives. Physical evidence can contradict written sources, revealing aspects of the past that contemporary chroniclers couldn't or wouldn't record. This has profound implications for how we understand other historical periods where the voices of the oppressed have been silenced. Perhaps most importantly, the stories of women like Lady Brigid, whether she survived or died in captivity, remind that individual human dignity persists even in the face of systematic dehumanization. Their suffering was real, their resistance was real, and their humanity endured despite every effort to destroy it. The legacy of Viking brutality toward captive women serves as a warning about the fragility of civilization and human rights. Sophisticated, successful societies can quickly develop and implement systems of organized cruelty when they view certain populations as less than fully human. The distance between medieval Ireland and modern human trafficking may be measured in centuries, but the underlying dynamics of power, profit, and dehumanization remain disturbingly similar. These stories matter because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. They remind us that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists in all human societies, and that vigilance is required to prevent its emergence. The women who suffered and died in Viking captivity deserve to have their stories told, not just as historical curiosities, but as warnings about what happens when society loses sight of the fundamental humanity of all its members. Their voices, silenced for over 1,000 years, speak to us still through the stones and bones and fragments of metal that archaeology recovers from the earth. They remind us that behind every great historical narrative of conquest and expansion lie countless individual stories of suffering that must not be forgotten. In remembering them, we honor not just their memory, but our own commitment to ensuring that such systematic horror never emerges again in our modern world.